Welcome everyone to the Pandemic Response Reading Series. Really glad that you can make it this evening. Just to let you know, my name is Lauren Carter, and I am broadcasting from just outside the city of Winnipeg, here in Manitoba, in Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis Nation, and a place where I'm very grateful to make my home. This is the 7th event in this series, which I started this spring to help writers who were putting new books out get some exposure, connect with readers. As a writer myself, I know how much a launch means, how gratifying it can be after years of hard work to talk about what you've been doing for the last several years, or however long it's been, and be able to kind of usher your creation into the world. So I just felt so badly for people with new books who wouldn't be able to do that, and so I really wanted to do what I could for those who didn't have other opportunities to do many readings or launches. So next Thursday, we have Alexis Kindland from Edmonton launching her debut novel, Mad Cow, which is published by Now or Never Publishing. And she'll be accompanied by Winnipeg's own Joel Robert Ferguson with his debut book of poetry, The Lost Cafeteria, which is with Signature Editions. To register for that, and also the final 2 upcoming events for the spring, please go to laurencarter.ca/PRRS. But this evening, we are in for a treat with host Ariel Gordon, and she will be introducing our guests. And also, if I could ask her to just talk a bit about how the evening will proceed with the Q&A session at the end, that would be great. Ariel is the author of 2 collections of poetry published with Palimpsest Press, which both won the Lansdowne Prize for Poetry at the Manitoba Book Awards. She is the ringleader for several projects, including Rites of Spring, a National Poetry Month project that sees poetry published annually in the Winnipeg Free Press. Her latest book is Tirade, Walking in Canada's Urban Forest, which was published by Woolsack and Wynne. And I will just ask Ariel to come on to the screen and take it away. Hi, Ariel.
Hello. So we need to get this chat going. So if some of you could say greet like you know chatter going on. You're greeting people, you're making personal remarks to each other about the reader, anything. But the chat is sort of the most fun of these sort of online, these virtual readings. And they really, oh, my internet connection is unstable. They really, for me, make launches fun. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Am I there now? All right. So how this is going to work today is I'm going to introduce both Matt and Brad. Matt being the publisher of At Bay Press, and Brad being the author of the book that we're launching. Then they're going to go ahead and do a Q&A for 20 minutes, approximately 20 minutes. Then Brad's going to do a reading, and then we're going to have a Q&A. And so how... I froze. I freeze all the time. Here, I'm going to do it on purpose. There. Anyways, so we're going to how we're going to do the Q&A is that there, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little button that says Q&A. So if you have a question, I would really appreciate it if you would write it down there, and then during the Q&A portion, I will read those out loud and mention you. You can write questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, but it would be really a lot easier for me if you could put all your questions down in the Q&A. And one more thing about the chat. Now Brad is going to be busy thinking about all of the questions that he's being asked by Matt. He's going to be busy thinking about what he's going to read and what he's going to say. But it's really nice because what happens is the chat is saved. And so later on, Brad can actually go back and read all the comments and see what you've said. And I took part in a launch at the beginning of the pandemic, a virtual launch, and reading the chat afterwards really made it memorable for me. So just be aware of that. Okay, so let's go ahead. I will introduce Matt and Brad. Sounds like I'm introducing people at a frat party, but I swear these are more people that are more interesting. Brad Smith was born and raised in the hamlet of Canfield in southern Ontario, a couple of hours from Toronto. After high school, he worked for the signal department of the Canadian National Railway for 3 years, and then got a chance to work on a rail project in South Africa. Upon returning from Africa, Smith worked all over the place: Alberta, British Columbia, Texas, at a variety of jobs. Farmer, signalman, insulator, truck driver, bartender, school teacher, maintenance mechanic, roofer, and so on. He became a carpenter and built custom homes in Canada. He still works as a carpenter when not writing. He now lives in an 80-year-old farmhouse near He now lives in an 80-year-old farmhouse near the north shore of Lake Erie. His books have been published by Penguin Canada, Doubleday Canada, Simon & Schuster Canada. The Goliath Run, his latest book, is published by At Bay Press. Now, MC Judry, or Matt, as I like to call him, or you, as I like to call him, is a Canadian writer, award-winning artist, designer, and publisher. His second novel, Of Violence and Cliché, was released in September 2013, followed by his collection of short stories, Charles Wood Road, Stories, in August 2014, which was nominated for a 2015 Manitoba Book Award. His most recent novel, Phenonymous, was released in 2019, and it was also nominated for a Manitoba Book Award. Anyways, please welcome Brad and Matt.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Brad.
I have to say, I'm really flattered that Donna Morrissey took her hair out of curlers to be here tonight. That was awesome.
It's weird coming in like this to the room, and you think, well, I'm going to see everybody, and then all I'm left with is Brad. That's the only person I can see right now. So, and I see that chat button just blinking away. So I'm glad to see that. That means that people are, well, hopefully excited to see Brad. I'm sure they're not that excited to see me. But it's totally my pleasure tonight to be hosting alongside Ariel Gordon and presenting Brad's new book, The Goliath Run. It's very exciting as a publisher. It's very exciting as a reader. And it's wonderful to be working with Brad Smith. So welcome to everybody. To get things started, I'm going to read just a little bit from the jacket of the Goliath Run, so that everybody here who hasn't read the book, which I'm assuming that a lot of people already have, because we've been shipping out quite a few copies. I'm going to read from the jacket and let you know what the book's all about. And then we're going to really try to paint Brad into a corner here with a whole bunch of questions that will hopefully, we'll be able to really dig under the surface of what Brad's book is all about and what Brad's all about. So the Goliath Run. When a deranged loner kills 26 people in a Pennsylvania schoolyard, the country is stunned and devastated. Among those catatonic with grief is Jo Matheson, an organic farmer who has lost her goddaughter in the shooting. Sam Jackson, an egotistical right-wing TV talking head, has sliding ratings and faces imminent cancellation. He arrives in Pennsylvania, and during a rant, He blames the parents of the dead children. He intends the tirade to be his last salvo, but incredibly, his ratings climb, while Jo watches from her farmhouse in upstate New York, incensed. Sam rides the wave, shouting that it's time to take the country back from the left-wing weaklings who don't have the courage to protect their children. When he is asked to run for Congress, he accepts and amplifies his message. Watching these developments in horror, Jo finally decides there is actually something she can do. She kidnaps Sam's 10-year-old daughter. That's the Goliath Run jacket market copy. And this is Brad Smith. And we're going to get right into the interview with Brad Smith here. Brad, first, let's talk about the inception of the book. Where did things begin for you?
I've always been a political junkie. This is really the first political book I've written. But a few years ago, before the current administration in the States, things got so polarized that there were certain individuals on TV, talking heads, that were kind of getting my ire, just because of the mendacity and just how polarizing it was. And I felt like I wanted to write a book based on one of those guys. So the lead character, Sam Jackson, is a bit of a composite of several people who are on the air in the US. This book, people should know, is set in the States. And I got this idea. It was not too long after the Sandy Hook shooting. And I was just so incensed at what was going on down there with all these shootings and these people walking around who shouldn't be in possession of a pea shooter, but were walking around with assault weapons and stuff. And I sat down and I actually wrote the first draft of this book in something like 3 weeks. And there's been considerable work done to it since, but that's sort of the genesis of it.
Right. And did you find it hard writing about US politics being a Canadian?
I found it hard writing about a school shooting.
Yeah.
I found that really difficult, even though I was used to reading about it and seeing it on TV a lot. In terms of the political system and stuff in the States, no, because like I say, I'm one of those guys that probably watches too much CNN and too much CBC and too much MSNBC and stuff like that. So it's kind of it's like second nature to me. I should maybe start watching the Three Stooges again. I'd be a little more encouraged.
Well, speaking of that, what was it like writing a novel like this during, the Trump era? How was the Trump era an influence on your novel?
Well, it's interesting because when I wrote the first draft, he was not on the horizon. And even when he came on the horizon, I think we all recall that nobody thought he was going to win. It kind of played into it a little bit because he is just, he's up that ante so much in terms of the partisan stuff, the lies. So it kind of justified what I was doing to a certain extent. But he became a character in the next draft that he wasn't in. His name wasn't mentioned in the first draft because we didn't see him coming.
Yeah, I think a lot of people felt that way, and I think that they were shocked at that aspect. And for you, having the course of writing the book, you held the book up a number of times in order to capture the political climate accurately. Was the risk of waiting, to capture that worth the reward?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet, Matt. Certainly, we never saw this coming. The pandemic. It's changed things a little bit,
right?
But yeah, in terms of the timing, I think maybe it's a little more apropos because of that. But I mean, it's unfortunate. Of course, we all would much rather prefer that this hadn't happened. But it has increased the partisanship a lot.
Right. Yeah. And what's it like for you when you have a book that's now out there in the world and you're seeing so many of the things that you wrote about like coming true and starting to come true? What kind of personal impact does that have on you? I mean, obviously with the aspects of the really difficult nature of some of the subject matter, such as the school shooting, but then also to a lot of the political items, and a lot of the laws that are in place in the U.S. and everything that you wrote about. You're seeing a lot of that come true, and you're seeing a lot of that being realized in your book. What's that like for you?
Well, I wouldn't say it was satisfying, because you would kind of wish that it wasn't all
Right.
becoming that accurate. I mean, I guess it is somewhat prescient, more so than I thought when I started writing it. But at the same time, what's happening is not great, but to chronicle it is important. It's always important to chronicle history.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, it's interesting too, because I'm sure you didn't set out to like say to yourself, I'm going to write this book and I want this to come true so that the book feels more accurate. You wrote this as fiction, and your whole perspective on this was fiction. And so how do you sit down and write that fiction? Where do you start? Like, where is the genesis for something like this?
well, with this book, probably more so than any other book I've read, basically it was all there. I mean, it was happening in real time,
Mm-hmm.
The Sam Jackson character, for instance, I could name 3 or 4 guys that would just fit him to a T. So it wasn't quite like sitting down and inventing a character. Like, for instance, my last book, The Return of Kid Cooper.
Right.
I invented Kid Cooper out of whole cloth, but it wasn't quite like that with this. So it was a little bit different in terms of process, because I already knew who these people were. And the tricky thing was finding a plot to kind of bring them together, and to shine a light on exactly who these guys were, instead of who they pretend to be.
Right. And what about settling on a title? Why the Goliath Run?
Well, you know a little bit about that, Matt. We had it was going to be No Surrender for the longest time, but it didn't quite have a political feel to it. For people who haven't read the book, No Surrender is a catchphrase that the Sam Jackson, this right-wing talking head, picks up. And there was another title, and we were talking about getting something about the politics into it. He uses his position as an on-air personality to run for Congress. So it's about a run for Congress. And then the other protagonist, Jo Matheson, who ends up, I don't know how much spoiler alert.
Careful, Brad.
She ends up doing something. She becomes the David, and he's the Goliath. And it was just one night I got thinking about that, and I said, well, this guy is sort of the Goliath. And I put those 2 words together. At one point we talked about putting the word pivot in the title, because certain politicians are so good at pivoting nowadays. You ask them a question about the weather, and they tell you a question about their shoes, or an answer about their shoes. But that wasn't quite working either. And then when the Goliath Run came to mind, it seemed to fit. And I remember emailing you, and you liked it right away.
I did, yeah. I thought it really captured it, the vision of the novel and what the story is about. But we also had talked about another title, The Pivot Game, which at one point I think we both really liked that title, and I thought that might be it. But I mean, the Goliath Run is the better title, but we were talking about The Pivot Game.
Yeah, because we use the word pivot a lot.
Right.
We use a lot, but it wasn't quite working for me.
Right, exactly.
It sounded a little. It sounded like a book about con men or something like that.
Yeah, it did a bit, didn't it? And the Goliath Run just has that has that powerful feeling. And not to keep mentioning Trump, but there's something sort of terrifyingly Goliath about him, just in his presence and the way he looms over everybody and tries to push everybody around. And I know that Sam Jackson isn't directly a derivative of Donald Trump, but there are elements of that in his character, and so the Goliath Run does have a real true ring to it. And the book touches on some real life political issues that are happening right now, and it's no secret that your political views sort of run to the antithesis of that right-wing world. Does the book speak to your own politics?
Yeah, like definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'm not like Stephen Colbert, who pretended to be a Republican to you know, to make a pretty funny TV show. No, it's obvious. It's obviously how I feel,
Mhm.
and it's, you know, I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think if anything, this pandemic has even shone a spotlight on it even more. You know.
Yeah, I think you're pretty accurate on that too. We're pretty lucky to be in a country where we have some really great support in place during this difficult time. But I want to get back to the novel and obviously the difficulty of the school shooting. What do you think about you know, Canadian versus U.S. Gun control laws? And what do you think about these things happening? And do you feel that that stronger gun control laws would put a lot of this to rest, or is it something deeper?
It's deeper than that, but they're going to help. I mean, it's 90% of the American public is in favor of background checks. The Congress passed that law and is sitting ready to go into the Senate, and the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, will not introduce it to the Senate. So you think 90% of the people in the country want this, that's a no-brainer to pass that, right? But it's something that's not going to happen down there, and it's got a lot to do with the power of the NRA. I don't think anything would stop what's going on, but you can certainly curtail it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Background checks are expensive, are important. The recent thing that we've done in Canada here with the assault rifles, I have people who disagree with me very strongly about this. One of them's about 200 yards away right now, my neighbor. But it's true, you don't need them. But I think Canada has a different perspective on it because we don't have the gun as part of our lifeblood of our history, whereas the States do, you know. And it's a really difficult thing down there to get people to give up their guns. It's going to be difficult here, but it's one of those situations where there's so many shootings nowadays that anything is going to help, and doing nothing is definitely not going
Right.
to.
Yeah. So I'm seeing in the chat here that folks would like us to chat a lot more about your book. So let's move over to the book now and away from.
I think Donna Morrissey wants me to tell the ending. Are you ready, Donna?
Just read the last page.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk a bit about the book and the book's premise and how you came up with that?
Basically, it started with school shooting. It started with Sandy Hook, and it started with the individual, the fictional character that I created, the TV talking head who has a bully pulpit, and he's very opinionated, and he's one of those guys who says things just to cause up trouble. So I had that in mind, and then I wanted a way to bring a method to bring him down. So that's when I kind of come up with the idea of the kidnapping, and also the idea that he was struggling in his ratings, so he was at a position where he would do anything
right
to keep going. And so I put the two together, and it was like I say, it was tough to write about a school shooting, but I needed something big like that for him to use something even bigger, because he ends up using the school shooting to advance not just his ratings, but when he decides to run for Congress, he just beats it like a rented mule. This whole thing, how the parents let their kids down, and he talks a bunch of nonsense, but there are people who believe people who talk a bunch of nonsense, as we know.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the platform gets built for him to begin to develop his political career.
Exactly. Well, he's approached by two guys who are loosely based on the Koch brothers,
Right.
multi-billionaires who basically go around the country funding people's campaigns and their runs for Congress or the Senate or whatever. And so that kind of he really isn't thinking about that until these guys approached him and said, "You're riding a wave here now with the stuff that you're talking about, the school shooting, and we think we can get you elected."
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite character in the book?
As far as minor characters go, Joe's father, Henry, he's a 70-something-year-old ex-hippie who he works on, they have a farm together. They have a truck farm. They grow vegetables and stuff, and he makes his own wine and he grows his own pot. And he's a bit of a character, and he's a kind of a crusty guy, but he's got a heart as big as an Oldsmobile. So yeah, I like him a lot. Every book I've ever written, there's always been a character who surprised me. Which is one of the reasons I don't do outlines or anything, because I always think it's going to take away from the spontaneity of what I'm doing.
Right.
And he wasn't even going to be there to begin with, but I needed somebody to bounce Jo off when she starts coming up with these ideas, some of which weren't real sensible. And so I kind of slid him in there just for a scene or two, and then he kind of took over. So for a kind of a secondary character, I would probably say him. And the cop Bell kind of surprised me a bit too, because a lot of times my police officers aren't that honorable. And so the Detective Bell is a very an honorable guy, and he's got a lot of integrity, and he's willing to bend the rules to make things right.
What about the relationship between him and the partner?
His police partner?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the police partner's not in there. Actually, I'm going to read a section for the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
But he's basically a lone wolf after they started getting into the investigation.
Right.
Investigating on his own. Oh, you don't mean Dugan, do you? The FBI? Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh no, I thought you meant Olson.
No.
Yeah, the relationship there is very fraught, and they truly do not like each other. And the FBI agent looks down his nose at Bell and belittles him at every turn. But in the end, it kind of gets turned around. Oh, sorry, Donna.
So when you're writing what makes a successful character for you, especially a protagonist, somebody like Jo, who isn't entirely a protagonist. In some ways, she actually falls into the category of antagonist, because she does something that many people would consider, a really huge crime.
Yeah, it's a huge crime. I think in the past, I've kind of revisited the theme about somebody doing something wrong to make something right. And I think that's a pretty good description of Jo. And also a character would never, ever do something like that right up until they do something like that. When they feel like they're kind of painted into a corner, or they feel like they have to do something, they don't have any other choice but to do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and with that character, as you're moving forward throughout the book, do you see a strong character evolution for that character? Like how does that play out as you write each chapter? What's that development like for you?
Well, especially with Jo, it was a real building thing, because at the start she's just this kind of, I don't know if she was content, but she was working her farm and growing organic vegetables, and sort of a new age type of thing to do. Mm-hmm. And then she has this incredible thing happen to her, and her grief is just, mind numbing. And for the longest time, she realizes, she knows in her heart that she can't do anything about it. But as things build up and build up and build up, then all of a sudden, that's where the switch kind of goes on in her head, and she realizes she can do something about it, even though what she's going to do about it might not be a really good idea.
Right. Yeah.
But sometimes that's the way those things work.
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of it, right? Because there is an organic succession that happens as you're writing through it, and I'm sure a seasoned writer such as yourself gets used to that and just grapples onto it.
Yeah.
The book, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, paces like a well-made film, and each chapter plays out like a gripping scene. Do you write with that in mind, or does something like that just happen?
Yeah, it just happens. It's like I've been asked that question before, and it's basically the only way I can write. I'm very visual, and I don't know how else to write, to tell you the truth. So,
right. Do you see a book like this that it could be adapted into a film? Do you see something like that you could actually potentially see it on the big screen?
Yeah, totally. I'm just looking at the right side there. Do we see Martin Scorsese's name anywhere?
Yeah. Are you in the audience by any chance? Because the rights are available.
Yeah.
How do you know? How do you know when the book is done? How do you know when it's ready to be sent out to a publisher? Like,
I write a first draft. I write every day. When I write a first draft, I write 5 pages a day. And I was actually fortunate enough many years ago to talk to Elmore Leonard. I was supposed to ask him for a blurb, and somebody gave me his phone number. I think it was for All Hat, maybe. And so I cold called him at home, and we got talking about process, as writers do. And he told me he writes 5 pages a day, and I said, well, so do I. And he says, but the next day he edits those 5 pages, which I never ever thought about, because I used to write a first draft and set it aside. And so I started doing that after talking to him. And by the way, I never did ask him for a blurb because he was too nice to me, and I felt like it was, I couldn't ask him.
that was going to be my next question.
No, we talked about baseball more than we talked about books. He was a Tigers fan. So I started doing that, and I find that those 5 pages, sometimes it'll take me an hour and a half to edit them the next day, which sounds unusual because I've just written it. But now when I get finished that first draft, it's more like a second draft. So I do set that aside, and I have a couple people who I ask to read it, and then I do another pass, and at that point I feel like it's ready to show to people.
Fair enough. And what about writing process for you? Are you a day, nighttime writer?
Morning.
Morning.
Yeah.
So get up, crack of dawn, fresh coffee in hand.
No. I like to say that I'm up at 5:30 and at the computer, but I'm up reading newspapers online, and I've got CNN or CBC on or something like that, and I kind of procrastinate for an hour and a half or even longer before I start.
Right.
It doesn't matter because I'm going to write 5 pages anyway, so it doesn't matter if I start at 6 or I start at 7:30 type thing, right?
So you get up and you've got your news headquarters ready to go. You're digging into it. Now, your 5 pages, do you ever write more, or is it that felt good, I'm done?
Pretty much. Hemingway always said, quit when it's going really well because it makes it easier to start the next day.
Right.
Yeah. So like, I'm not going to say when I get to the bottom of page 5, I won't do another paragraph or a couple paragraphs or something like that. And that's usually 5 days a week. And on the weekends, I'll write maybe 2 or 3 pages on Saturday and a couple pages on Sunday, only because it makes it easier to start again on Monday.
Excellent.
Yeah. Rather than take 2 days off.
And your location, you're sort of, I mean, it's not like you're in Toronto. You're well outside the city. I guess technically Dunnville.
Yeah, I'm out in the country a couple miles from a place called Dunnville, and not far from Lake Erie. So I was already isolating.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What's it like for you, work-wise, but you're already in an environment where you kind of have your space to yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure it's true of most writers. This doesn't really change what we do much, not like everybody else who, either going to work or they're laid off or whatever, So I finished the first draft of a book of this. I started in January. I just finished it in the end of March. So no, nothing really changes in terms of my work and my work ethic.
Fair enough. And for those that are watching, is this your writing table in the background?
Yes.
Yeah, that's where all the magic happens.
Well, we hope.
So now the $100 question. What was it like working with a great publishing house like At Bay Press?
I have no complaints. It was,
I had to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's so far so good. And you guys you're setting up Zoom launches, and this is I see a lot of people are saying this is kind of their first time. I see my friend Jim White is talking about Leave It to Beaver. He's ratting me out because I watch Leave It to Beaver in the morning. Yeah, so this is a brand new thing for me to do this.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments flying around that seem that the desk looks so clean. They're a little shocked by this.
Yeah, the desk didn't look like that a few days ago, and I made the mistake of sending a picture of it to my niece, Natasha, who's 9 years old and just chimed in, and she is talking about how clean it looks. And Natasha knows that probably in a month from now, it's not going to look that good.
Well, thanks, Brad. Thanks for answering all my questions. And I know Ariel, well, at least I'm hopeful that Ariel's going to pop back in here because I think there's a number of questions, or maybe it's supposed to be me that's going to ask these questions from.
No,
Oh, it's
So
going to
what-
be Ariel. Okay,
No,
good.
no, so what's happening now is Brad has to read.
Oh yes, Brad's doing his reading from the
Don't-
book. My apologies.
don't
And
forget
then
the
Brad
read-
will answer some questions from the audience. So Brad, you're on deck here. I'm gonna mute my mic and let you read from your wonderful book, The Goliath Run. Everybody, here comes Brad.
Okay, thank you. Peter Wing just asked if that's the Silver Spur Award, and Peter, it is the Silver Spur Award. So I'm going to read a little bit about, as you probably have been able to figure out now, that there is a school shooting, and this right-wing guy takes advantage of it, talks a bunch of nonsense, and there's a kidnapping. His daughter is kidnapped by somebody who can't handle his crowing anymore. So this is just after the kidnapping has happened, and they suspect that her driver, these people are very wealthy, that the person that drives her to school every day might be the one that took her. So you're going to meet two cops here, a guy named Bell, who's a key figure, and a minor figure named Olson, and they're just checking out what's going on. And I'll put on my reading glasses now that I'm in my mid-40s. The kid is dead, Olson said. Bell was driving, moving across town at 96th Street in heavy traffic. They got in the call while they were at the station, just coming on shift. First, they'd driven to the office of the car service to talk to the manager there, and now they were heading for Sam Jackson's house on the Upper West Side. It was a few minutes to 7, and the streets were moving at a glacial pace. You don't know that, Bell said. I know stats, Olson told him. 3 hours in, 99% of the time, the kid's dead, assaulted, strangled, tossed in a dumpster or the river, or some variation of that scenario. Well, you're a cheerful bastard, Bell told him. It's in my blood, Olson said. I'm Scandinavian. Bell glanced over to see if he was making a joke. He and Olson had been partners for less than 2 weeks. Bell didn't know the man aside from seeing him around the station. He was in his 50s, pushing retirement, Bell would have guessed. From where, Bell asked. Sweden. But you were born here, Bell suggested. Are you first generation? Hell no, my family came here in 1897. Then it's about time you cheered up, isn't it? Bell said. Olson shrugged. I'm just telling you that the girl's dead. I'm not so sure, Bell said. If this was a random grab, sex thing, then I might agree with you. But this feels different. How so? The celebrity angle for one thing, Bell said, the money factor for another, and there's this disgruntled driver who's been given notice. Maybe he's the perv, Olson said. Maybe he is, Bell admitted. There were a couple of uniformed officers at the Jackson house. The wife's name was Rachel. She was on her feet in a living room that opened into a huge kitchen. A tall, good-looking blonde, early 40s maybe. The place was nice, the furniture and fixtures expensive and tasteful, which surprised Bell somewhat. He'd seen Sam Jackson's show and he was expecting something garish, gold taps, nymphs and fountains, like Trump. Presumably the wife was in charge of decorating. She was understandably on edge, but dry-eyed. She had a friend there with her, a skinny brunette with puffy lips and an artificially tanned skin. There was a pot of coffee on the island that separated the rooms and a box of pastries from Starbucks. Bell guessed that the friend had brought the food. Olson took the uniforms aside and talked to them before telling them they could go. Rachel Jackson watched them leave and then turned to Bell. So you guys are detectives? What have you found out? Well, we talked to the manager of the car service. The car is not back. It's him, Rachel said. It's that driver. She indicated the door just taken by the uniforms. I told them that. Yeah, and they told us, Bell said. We're checking him out. Sean McElroy, right? You recently gave him notice? You fired him? That's what this is about, she said. That vindictive bastard took my daughter. You might very well be right, Bell said. Then why isn't that man in custody? The brunette demanded. Bell looked at her, wondering if the Botox had seeped into her brain. We don't know where Mr. McElroy is at this time, he said. He turned back to Rachel. As of right now, we don't have the car, and we don't have McElroy, and we don't have your daughter. We do know that McElroy was bonded, which means he doesn't have a record, and he isn't registered as a sex offender. If he did this, we should hope that he's just, you know, teaching you a lesson, in his mind anyway, and maybe after some money. What kind of person would do that? She asked. What do you know about him? Olson asked. Did you interact with him much? Not really, Rachel said, just to say hello once in a while. My husband thinks he's a boozer. Olson glanced at Belle. McElroy's boss had suggested the same thing. Rachel pulled a cell phone from her pocket and walked away as she punched in a number. She stood looking out a bay window for a moment before turning back to them. Why doesn't she answer her phone? Olson walked over. Your daughter has a phone with her? Of course, Rachel said. It goes right to voicemail, which means he turned it off, or maybe he destroyed it. Did you tell the officer she has a phone? Olson asked. No, I didn't think to. They didn't ask? No. All right, Belle said. We need the phone number, we need the server, and we need the account number. We can trace the phone. Even if it's turned off? It might get turned on, Olson said. Can you get us that information? While she went into another room, Belle looked at the brunette. Friend of the family, he asked. Yes, Lila DiMaggio. DiMaggio, Belle said. You related to the Clipper? Clipper, she asked. You mean like a barber? Never mind. Belle indicated their surroundings. Where's the husband anyway? He's in Wyoming. The brunette was quite dramatic in her body language, her manner of speech. But on his way home as we speak, he's a very famous person, you know. She glanced toward the other room, then leaned close to Belle and whispered, and they are very well off. That's what this is about, if you ask me. This driver wants money, which is a good thing, right? I mean, as opposed to it being a sex crime or something like that. Before Belle could respond, Rachel returned with the paperwork on the daughter's phone. Olson took it from her and sat down at the island with his cell to call it in. Belle watched as he poured himself a cup of coffee and took a scone from the box while he waited for someone in the tech department. Belle turned to Rachel. Her lips were tight, her breathing measured. He could see that she was doing her utmost to keep it together. I want you to tell me what happened when you gave McElroy his notice. What he said, how he acted, anything you remember. He asked for another chance, she said. And when I said no, he said I wasn't being fair. Was he pissed off, Belle said, raising his voice. Did you feel threatened at all? He was more whiny than pissed off, like the world was against him. One of those guys. One of those guys, Belle thought. Those guys don't usually abduct children. They're more likely to be found on a bar stool somewhere telling their tale of woe to anybody who will listen. But Belle couldn't know that about this guy, Sean McElroy. There were exceptions to every rule. At the island, Olson hung up his phone. He sat there with his coffee. Obviously, he was okay with Belle doing the dirty work. Belle turned to Rachel again. All right, there's something we need to cover here, he said. I apologize in advance, but I have to ask, is everything okay with you and your husband? What are you talking about? Is there a chance that your daughter might be with your husband? Belle paused. It happens sometimes when couples aren't getting along. This isn't one of those times, detective, she said coldly. Sam's in Wyoming. He announced 3 days ago that he's running for Congress. I'm not sure when he would find time to abduct our daughter, even if we were having problems, which we are not. Okay, Belle said. Olson's phone rang and he picked it up. Yeah, he said and listened. No shit. We're on our way. He hung up and looked at Belle. They found the car, parking lot over in Williamsburg. Rachel moved towards Olson, her bottom lip quivering. Vanessa, she asked. No, Olson said. He looked at Belle. But they found the driver. He's not our guy. Why not, Belle asked. They found him in the trunk.
Oh, that's great. Well, if that doesn't leave him wanting more, I don't know what will. Thanks for the read, Brad. And I want to take a moment here because I feel like we've been really holding out on the crowd. I want to show the book for those that haven't seen it. So I'm going to hold it up to the screen here so everybody can see it. Take my hand down. Here's the back cover. Ooh. This is it. Brad Smith's book. Now that in all its glory, glorious hardcover. Brad Smith and the Goliath Run. Ariel's back here, and so Ariel, is it you that's going to ask Brad some questions now?
I'm going to ask him all the questions. There are 8 so far.
Okay, then I'm going to mute my mic. Brad, prepare to receive the onslaught of participant questions.
I am ready, I think.
Well, great reading. Thank you so much for the reading. That was great. All right, so the first question, I'm just going to do them in order. First question is from Peter Wing, and he wants to know, is the antagonist based particularly on Sean Hannity / Tucker Carlson of Fox News?
Oh, you want me to name names, do you, Peter? Thank you very much.
I think that's what it was, yeah.
It's definitely a composite, and to tell you the truth, the Sam Jackson guy writes historical books that are become bestsellers. So back in 15, when I first started writing it, when I was kind of delving into the first draft, it was more Bill O'Reilly than anybody else, because he kind of fit that mode of the writer and a bombastic type of guy. But it definitely is a composite, and Bill O'Reilly, of course, he ended up going the way of many people from that network. But it's definitely not based on one particular guy.
All right. Hopefully that will satisfy Peter. He can let us know in the comments. But don't worry, there are more questions from Peter in this list. But next we're going to go to Liz McDonald, who says, okay, this book is a tough subject. How would Uncle Hippo discuss this with his strong and courageous nieces?
Uncle Hippo. That's too long of a story to tell, but I'm known as Uncle Hippo, and at least one of my nieces is listening, Natasha, and she's also a writer. She's 9 years old, and she has written 2 books so far about a horse named Stone. So Matt, if you're looking for a young upcoming writer, you better keep your eye on her. As for Liz's question, it's how would I describe it to my nieces? Well, the sad fact of the matter is, it'd be nice if I didn't have to describe what a school shooting is and some of this partisan response to it. But it's unfortunately part of the world that we live in, and hopefully by the time they get to be adults, maybe it won't be as bad as it is today.
Liz has a follow-up question. Is there a character here that you might want to build on that would carry on like Virgil Caine?
That's a good question, Liz. She's sitting there drinking rye, coming up with these questions. I know she is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. The protagonist, Jo, I think this is kind of a one-off with her. She's not going to become a serial kidnapper. So this is really you can probably tell this is the first time I've even considered that, but I don't think so.
Can I ask, just from my own brain, are most of your books, have they been linked with serial characters, or have you written very many one-offs?
I've written a few one-offs, and no, there's not. No. Say that question again. Serial.
I guess I want to know what proportion of your works so far have been linked books versus one-offs.
Oh, okay. This is my 12th book, I think. Yeah, my 12th book. So I wrote 3 Virgil Caine books. That's what Liz was talking about. And then I wrote a short series with a guy named, I'll think of his name, Carl Burns. I pulled that out of my hat. Yeah. So there was 2 books in that series, but the rest of them have all been one-offs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you find, and this is just me asking more questions, do you find that there's pressure from publishers to write linked books? Or a good book too?
With the Virgil Caine series, yeah, they were very much in favor of that.
Yeah.
That was the only time, though.
Yeah. Peter Wing has another question. Do you enjoy writing more about the antagonists or the protagonists?
Probably the protagonist, because I'm kind of on their side. You know? But I mean, evil people are interesting to write. I always try to have a background for stuff that's never on the page, like where that person came from, like not just geographically, but maybe what their family life was like, how they grew up, what made them the way they are. I think that's kind of a fascinating thing, just in general, when you run into people who don't turn out that well. What something happened to them at some point in their life that kind of transformed them.
Okay, another question from Liz, who is officially your biggest fan. She says, you must have so many ideas for books. How do you decide which ones are book worthy?
Um, that is a good question. Sometimes I've started thinking about a book and I've sat down and I've started writing it and it's just as flowed. Now you take a book like Kid Cooper, I wrote at least 4 other books trying to figure out how to write Kid Cooper. So sometimes they kind of are born fully, and sometimes they have to kind of germinate in your brain for years even. So I don't always know when. This book I did. This book I wrote very quickly. The first draft, as I mentioned earlier. I think maybe because it was so immediate what was going on, and I just had a really good idea what I want to do. And this one was sort of like getting some stuff off my chest a little bit. So I don't always know when to write, but yeah, I've never run out of ideas. I don't understand writer's block. There's more ideas out there than there is time, probably.
Donna Morrissey has asked a question. You've written so much about Americans. Are you starting to feel like one?
Not lately. Thank you, Donna. No, I feel like a Canadian, Donna. I'm not worthy to be called a Newfoundlander like you are, but I feel like a Canadian.
It is nice to be on this side of the border, given all the pandemic. Right now, I'm especially glad to be on this side of the border, let's say.
Yeah.
All right. Loretta Eldridge has a question. What song or artist would you pair with the Goliath Run?
Hi, Loretta. I haven't talked to her for a long time. I'm glad you're here, Loretta. Gee, I would love to come up with a prime. Maybe John Prine, because we've been talking and listening to John Prine so much lately. This isn't quite a fit, but his song "Paradise" about the rich guys that destroyed the Green River in the mining country. Sam Jackson is one of those guys who'd be right in there with a shovel. So yeah, let's go with John Prine's "Paradise."
To put it a slightly different way, were you listening to a particular album while you were writing this, or do you listen to music while you're writing?
No, I do when I'm editing, but not when I'm writing. I don't listen to anything or have TV on or anything when I'm writing a first draft.
So there was no particular soundtrack, not the one that you'd come up with later, but there's nothing that you were particularly listening to.
No, and there never has been. I find it distracting to have any noise going on, which is why I live out in the country, probably.
Donna Morrissey has asked why you did a hardcover. Lots of publishers are advising against hardcovers because of cost.
That's
Which isn't really a question for you, but
maybe I have to pop back in here on this one. Yeah. You know what? Brad's book deserves that kind of treatment. I know a lot of the small presses and medium presses don't do that. We kind of run against the grain in that way. For us, we want the book to be an object of art as much as it is a great work of writing. So we just try to pair that with the greatness of the writing. And I feel that, the tactile object of a book in hardcover is just that much more lovely, and the experience is just that much better. So yeah, I think that, in certain cases it doesn't always work, but for a book like Brad's, I can't imagine in any other format for a first edition. So there you go. I'm going to disappear again.
Matt, now that we've got you, what's the schedule? Is there a schedule for the trade book coming out?
Well, typically the way that we do that is we like to see the book in the marketplace in the trade for about a year before we would ever push it to a trade paperback. That's just the way it's done. If the hardcover, of course, sells like crazy, we'll keep it in print as long as we need to. But yeah, typically we reduce it down to a paperback at a cheaper cost somewhere about a year later. But don't let that deter you from buying the beautiful hardcover. See you later.
No, clearly they can't wait to buy this book in whatever format it appears.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so I have another question. Okay, so there's a question from Jason Mills, but after that, there's a question with a bit of a spoiler, that a plot question. So I'm going to push that down to the last question, and that way Donna Morrissey can leave or plug her ears if she doesn't want to hear this giveaway, this spoiler. So we're going to read all the other questions before we read that one, but I'm just going to say to the people listening, this is your last call for questions. I know you want to ask him something, and look, he's waiting right there to answer all your questions. All right, so the next question is from Jason Mills. It says, Brad, can you speak more about the prophetic aspects of the book that Matt mentioned earlier?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's about the polarizing effect of the media. And when I started writing it, it wasn't as bad as it is now, and the partisanship wasn't as bad as it is now, because it's worse than I've ever seen it. Both those things. I mean, I don't care what your politics are. If you watch Fox or you watch CNN, I mean, they're just so far apart. And when I started writing the book, they were apart, but they weren't this far apart. So it wasn't something I would have predicted, but due to certain things that have happened in that country, it's almost inevitable that it's happened after the election in 2016. So yeah, it turns out that it was prescient, but that was by accident.
Mm. Yeah, it's sort of the case you wouldn't actually want to be right about that.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, so this is a question from David Richardson is next. And it is, the FBI are usually pretty thorough, I am led to believe. What do you say to those who question their lack of finishing the job, if you know what I mean?
Was this a spoiler or not?
No, this isn't. Well, is this I don't know.
No, I don't think so. No, okay. The protagonist, that was one of the things that I wanted to get right, because it's sometimes difficult to write stuff nowadays with all the modern electronics and convenience we have. And I always say it kind of takes away from what a writer does a little bit, because I always think about Dashiell Hammett writing about the Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade. And so let's say when Sam Spade was investigating the theft, and he hears about this, I'll use the jargon of the day of the 1930s. He hears about the sexy dame who's singing for her supper down at the local gin mill. Well, Sam would jump into his Ford coupe and he would drive down to the gin mill for some FaceTime with her, right? Now Sam Spade would Google her. And it's just not the same. So I have to be careful with that in terms of the FBI stuff. And that's why I made a point. I really worked a lot on Jo's methods after the kidnapping, where she doesn't use a cell phone. She doesn't ever use a landline. She uses pay phones. The vehicle she uses, everything makes it, she really thinks it out well. So everything makes it really difficult for the FBI with their modern equipment to track her down. So I don't know if they came across as inept, but it just, the other cop was quicker than them. The FBI would have eventually found her, but the other cop was more, he was smarter than them. Yeah.
Okay, so Natasha wants to know, how does your ping pong game affect your writing?
Natasha hasn't beaten me yet in ping pong, but she's getting closer. So I feel pretty good after I leave there if I can get a couple of wins, but there's some days we play ping pong. Ping pong is a perfect game for social distancing because you're like 12 feet apart. We spray the paddles, we spray the balls. So yeah, if I go there and I have a good afternoon, usually we play Sunday afternoons, that I feel really well. But to say that the ping pong is affecting my writing, I'm not too sure about that. So Natasha, you better go to bed pretty soon.
Okay, I have one more sort of also amusing question, and then we're going to go to the spoiler alert.
I see people are saying there are no spoilers along the side there. So.
Oh, no spoilers?
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you can get in touch, or you can answer Joanna Kears's. If you go into the question, you can answer her question.
I will, yes.
So let's say that, and then we'll go to this question. Oh wait, one more. There's one more. Liz McDonald says, Brad looks like Captain Picard. Has he ever thought of writing science fiction?
I don't know who Captain Picard is, and no,
Star Trek.
never seen it. I've heard of it.
Okay.
Didn't you notice my buddy was saying earlier that I watched Leave It to Beaver? I don't watch Star Trek.
Well, the first iteration of Star Trek would have been about the same era as Leave It to Beaver.
Well, I missed it, so
yeah.
I'm gonna have to look.
Okay, and the last question. Oh, there's one more. They keep on popping up. Joanne says she can ask you in person when she sees you.
Okay.
All right. So, last question to end on a amusing note. David Richardson says, Brad, would you like to hear about my one par today?
I think we're out of time, aren't we?
So that's all I have.
First of all, he probably never made a par.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a willing respondent to all these questions.
This was great. It was very painless.
So it didn't feel like an interrogation?
No, not really. I've had interrogations. I know the difference.
Well, that might open up a whole other stream of questions.
Can I ask one more question before we go? So do you have like a FBI or cop person that you run things by or that you talk to with the yearbooks?
No. No, I've been around long enough that I know how that stuff works. I used to do research on that sort of thing when I didn't know it was research. Okay, let's leave it at that.
All right.
That's great.
Well,
Well, thanks, Brad.
This was great. Really good
Thank you.
questions.
Thanks,
Really good.
thanks everybody for tuning in. That was terrific.
Yeah, thanks for coming,
it was
everybody.
Really great crowd. Thank you all. Hope maybe you can all, gather somewhere in Dunville and stay far apart and have martinis now.
Exactly.
You
Down
could
at Dirt Road
congregate
somewhere.
outside Brad's house and shout at him.
Yes.
Yeah, as long as they bring martinis, they can do that. Or Manhattans are good,
So how about a virtual round of applause for Brad?
Yay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good idea. Yeah, congrats on the book. I can't wait to read it. I think it's probably going to be a gripper.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Night, guys.
Good night.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone
Thanks
for coming.
everyone for coming.